If you're looking for a high refresh rate monitor but also want good color accuracy, you might want to consider something like the Philips Evnia 25M2N3200U, which sports a flat, matte-coated 24.5-inch IPS panel, which operates a resolution of Full HD and a refresh rate that goes up to 310Hz. There's also support for adaptive sync technologies and also HDR. At the time of filming and in the UK, it can be found for £160. The links down description below or the pinned comments will take you to your localized Amazon store, and so will the QR code that can be found on your screen. Now in this video, which has been sponsored by the manufacturer, I'll be covering everything you need to know about it so you can make your own informed purchasing decision. Now to kick things off, I would just like to give you a disclaimer. Because here, if you do want to achieve the maximum refresh rate and resolution, you'll have to be connected over the singular DisplayPort 1.4 input. If, however, you're connecting over the two HDMI 2.0 ports, you'll find that the monitor will cap you at 240Hz at its native resolution of Full HD. Now with that out of the way and the monitor connected over DisplayPort to my desktop computer, I went ahead and did my tests. First off, in terms of its input lag, it was actually stonkingly good. It's worth bearing in mind over here that I had the low input lag mode enabled by the monitor's OSD. No idea why you'd ever want to disable it, but just something I thought I should re-emphasize. No issues when it came to registering my mouse input in a game such as Counter-Strike 2. Now in terms of the overall response time of the monitor, it's very much linked with the overdrive mode that you select via the monitor's OSD. You've got off, fast, faster and fastest. Now I'm going to be concentrating on the latter two. Looking at the faster mode preset at the maximum refresh rate of 310Hz, you'll be able to see that the average initial time clicks in at 5.59 milliseconds. However, the percent in window is very low at 23%. This thankfully does improve a little bit on the fastest mode preset, where you've got the average initial time clocking in at 3.87 milliseconds, but yet again the percent in window is a little low at 56%. Now in order to counteract this, I actually ran the monitor at a lower refresh rate of 240Hz, something I have noted before on other high refresh rate IPS monitors. And you can see over here on its fastest mode preset, the average initial time is still very impressive at 3.39 milliseconds, while the percent in window is sitting just close to 77%, which is far more acceptable for an LCD monitor. Now to quickly touch upon what the percent in window means, it effectively highlights how the monitor is responding at the set refresh rate that it should be achieving. In other words, in this monitor's case, it's not quite achieving what you would expect for a 310Hz monitor. And this is perfectly depicted with the UFO ghosting test, in that the motion clarity between 310Hz and 240Hz is not all that different. Now, of course, there might be some minor differences, but in all honesty, as I've hopefully highlighted, 240Hz is still very good. Now, it is also worth highlighting in this image that the inverse ghosting at its fastest mode preset is kept down to a bare minimum. However, sometimes you might be able to notice it, namely in more graphically intense games, and as a result you might want to dial it down a notch to the faster mode preset. In terms of the raw motion clarity, you've also got MBR, which stands for Motion Blur Reduction. You've got 20 level increments to choose from, at least if you have adaptive sync technologies disabled via the monitor's OSD and of course your computer. Here, this will give you far better motion clarity, and this can be quite handy for hardcore gamers alike. Now on that note, if you are looking to use AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync, in other words adaptive sync technologies, you can still utilize this in tandem with MBR. And this is thanks to a feature called MBR Sync, which will lock the brightness at a certain level. It's relatively bright in my own eyes. This effectively gives you the best of both worlds, increased motion clarity while giving you a tear-free gaming experience. Now this does actually bring me on to adaptive sync technologies, and in my case I've got an RTX 3080, and when connected over DisplayPort to the monitor, I had no sort of screen tearing or indeed flickering when it came to running the NVIDIA Pendulum demo. It is worth noting over here, the VRR range sits from 48 up to 310Hz, at least of course when connected over DisplayPort. Furthermore, I was able to run NVIDIA G-Sync simultaneously at 1080p with 310Hz refresh rate and also HDR. Yes, indeed, the monitor does support HDR, and this can be handy for those games that do support it. Though it's worth noting over here that just due to the overall brightness limitations of the monitor, it's not going to give you a real lifelike reproduction. Still, the HDR signal can be appreciated for certain gamers, and therefore you might want to enable it in certain instances. So moving on from the gaming performance, let's talk about image quality. And as a reminder, you have got a matte-coated 24.5-inch IPS panel. There is a dedicated sRGB mode that you can enable via the monitor's OSD, and it's good to see that you've got full brightness controls. In said mode, and using my calibrators, I noticed a gamut coverage of 98.5% and a gamut volume of 103.4%. Below you can see how it compares to the standard. The average delta sits at 2.05 and a maximum of 3.65. The tested contrast ratio clocks in at 1020:1, which is somewhat expected for an IPS panel, and the measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target sits at 6934 Kelvin at 100%. Below you can see how it also compares to the Gamma 2.2 standard. Now, if you're not going to be using it for any sort of color editing work or video grading, I'd highly suggest disabling the sRGB mode in order to unlock the wider color gamut of this monitor and get a little bit of extra pop from your image. Useful, for example, if you're watching movies or, of course, gaming. Now, aside from the color test, I should talk about brightness. And here in HDR, I clocked in between 438 to 445 nits, depending on the HDR mode selected via the monitor's OSD. In terms of its SDR brightness, it gets up to 372 nits, which is plenty bright, at least in my opinion, in a bright sunlit room. In terms of its minimum brightness, it gets down to 55 nits, showing a decent amount of range. And as for the MBR20 brightness, it clocks in at a locked 101 nits, and therefore means that in terms of the MBR levels, it will depend in terms of the overall brightness that you can achieve. Speaking of which, this brings me on to brightness uniformity, and you'll be able to see how my test with panel performed across the board. Similarly over here when it comes to the backlight bleed tests, and these were actually performed in a completely pitch black environment. Of course, your mileage may vary depending on the overall panel lottery that you're able to attain. Next up we get onto build quality, and here this 24.5-inch monitor won't take up too much space on your desk. This is thanks to the fact you've got a three-side borderless design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. The power LED that can be found at the bottom right-hand side can be also adjusted and fully disabled. Now the stand itself is made in part of recycled material, which shows good sort of sustainability credentials. It is also very ergonomic by providing you height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments. And that's actually quite nice because you can find the right sort of position for you. Of course, if you do not want to use the built-in stand, you can replace it with a VESA compatible one, allowing you to place it on a monitor arm or a multi-monitor setup. Now at the back right hand side of the monitor you might have noticed a joystick button, and yes indeed this is to access the monitor's OSD, which is very comprehensively laid out and provides you all the right options that you require, although navigating it might take a little bit of getting used to, especially if you've never used a Philips monitor in the past. Elsewhere you've also got the Philips Evnia Precision Center software as well. This is a software which doesn't have to operate over USB because the monitor doesn't have a USB hub. The software does provide you all the right options that you require and can be quite handy to adjust certain settings on the fly without having to access the hardware-based OSD. Elsewhere, I would like to point out that the monitor does not have any built-in speakers, but rather has a 3.5mm jack headphone output, therefore allowing you to plug in your headphones directly into the monitor and therefore outputting audio. So there we have it. Hopefully you've enjoyed my detailed overview of this Philips monitor. I'll be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below. As a reminder, if you do want to find it on your localized Amazon store, make sure you check out the links down in the description below, the pinned comment, or by scanning the QR code that can be found on your screen. Now if you've enjoyed this detailed video, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing, and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.